Today's daf is daf Chaf Zayin, and the Mishnah is going to tell us about different parts of the Menachos that are la'akiv, that are likuva, meaning that you can't be missing any part. It's got to be mole, it's got to be sholem. For example, hakometz miuto ma'akiv es rubo. If you're missing even a small part, then the carbon is not kosher. The mincha is psula. That's as far as the kometz is concerned. Now, this halach of kometz applies twice. It applies, number one, at the time of the kmitza, if at the time of the kmitza there's something missing. And number two, it applies at the time of the haktorah, right? The kometz, after it's removed, has to be burnt on the mizbeach and it has to be sholem. Isaron miuto ma'akiv esrubo. Now we're talking about the component of the mincha, which is an isaron of kemach. And the Gemara is going to derive this from psukim. An isarin, which is a tenth of an ephah, is the minimum amount of flour that we need for a mincha. And even if part of it is missing, then the mincha is invalid. You can't take the kometz and do kmitza. Mishnah goes on, Hayayin mi'uto ma'akiv rubo. We're talking now about nisachim, nischei mayim, yayin. And there's minchas nisachim, which are accompanying the Ola and Shlomim Karbonos, and it depends on what the animal is. If we're talking about an ayil, then it's Shlish Hin. If we're talking about a keves, it's Revias Hahin. And if we're talking about a par, it's Chatzi Hahin. Any of those amounts, if they're missing, then the mincha, the nisachim are possible. Hashemen mi'uto ma'akiv rubo. Talking about the oil component in the minchas nisachim, and it's the same three measurements that we mentioned before for the yayin. And once again, is mi'uto memait ma'akiv rubo. Hasoles v'Hashem ma'akvim zeh. Mincha is made up of number one, soles, which is fine flour, number two, shemen, and each component is critical. Hakometz v'Levona ma'akvim zeh. The kometz needs the levona needs the kometz, and each one therefore is ma'akev the other one, which means you have two matirim that are necessary to be matir the shirayim, and these are the kometz after the kmitza, and number two, the levona. And we're going to now learn the principle of shana lava kosovli akev. That whenever the Torah repeats itself, or if it uses the word chuka or kacha, that indicates that it's likuva. So therefore, my timer, how do we know that you need the entire kometz? Well, makro malo kumto, trace him twice. It says in the pasuk malo kumto, and this is all at the beginning of Vayikra in Perek Beis and in Perek Hey. And Isarim miuto makvis rubo. My timer, how do we know that the Isaron has to be absolutely complete? Omakra misolta. So you have a mapik hey at the end of the word. And that tells you that the solus has to be it, like the way that the Torah describes it. Shem chasra kol shu psula. If it's missing part of the Yisaron, then it's pasul. Hayayim yutabak vesrubo and Hashem yutabak vesrubo. These are derived from extra word kacha. In both cases, the Torah used the word kacha, and this you'll see in Bamidbar Perek Tesvav, Kochi Yasel Ashor HaEchad. And again, with regard to Minchas Nesachim, it says the word Kocha, the Minchas Nesachim Kocha. Minchas Nedava, how do we know that Minchas Nedava also, we require that the entire amount of Shemen be complete, nothing missing. Amar Kra Umishamna, again with the hay at the end with a mapik hay, the entirety of the oil. Shemchisa Kol Shehu Psula. Hashemen Vasos Ma'akvim Zed Zeh. How do we know that the shemen is ma'akiv the souls vice versa? Misalta umishmana. Now, the Torah then says migirsa umishamna. So the first word misalta, that refers to the solace, as it says misalta, and it has to be complete. Then it says migirsa. Now, girsa is apparently a different type of a carbon. This is the carbon of Omer, I believe. I hope I didn't mess up on that. Just one second. Yeah, the geres is also fine flour. The Omer, flour made of barley of Siora, also says geres, and it means that they had to remove the outer shell of the grain, and it's crushed, and therefore it's got to be migirsa, which means complete. The total amount is there, nothing's missing. Al kol livonasa, again the mapikei, and v'eskol halavona asher al hamincha. Now the Mishnah goes on and says, Shnei seiri Yom HaKippur ma'akvin zetzeh. Right, there were two seirim that were brought on Yom HaKippur, the soil Hashem and soil Azazil, and you have to have both. Shnei kivsei atzeres. On Shavuos, they brought two lambs, and they were accompanied by the shteil lechem, and the two lambs are matir the shteil lechem, and you need both lambs ma'akvim zetzeh. Shtei chalos, there are the shteil lechem of Shavuos, and ma'akvim zu'udzu, meaning you need both chalos. Shnei bazichim ma'akvim zetzeh. In the lechem upon him, on top of the lechem, they put two bazichim that were made of levona, and you needed both bezichin. Both bazich is a kind of a ladle. Now, hastorim v'bezichim akvim zetzeh. The lechem upon him had two storim, each of 6 lechamim, and you need all 6 on each of the 2 storim. If one of the 2 storim is chaser, it's possible. And a bazichin, which is also organized, one bazich on one seder of 6 lechamim, another bazich on the other seder of 6 lechamim, and you need it all. Shnei minim shebenazir. Now the nazir has 2 minim of lechamim, and one is called, I guess you'd call it like a kind of a wafer, and the other is called like a bread. And the nazir brings an aisle. This is the famous Elo Shel Nazir, and it was accompanied by 2 categories of breads. Each one of the categories had 10 breads, all told 20 breads, 10 loaves, and 10 wafers. And these 2 types or categories of lechamim are ma'akvim, that's essential one to the other. Shlosha sheva para. Now we're talking about the paraduma. The paraduma had, of course, the mechatos, which is made up of a concoction of the efer hapara together with mayim chaim, and that's called mechatos. But into this concoction, they had to add 3 things. They had to add a certain kind of wood called a cedar wood, a certain brush, a low brush on the ground called hesap, and a strip of red wool. And all of these are essential in order for the water to be effective, to be mitayar the Tomei Mes. We'll see once again with regard to Mitzorah, the same 3 additions that have to be added. But first, the Mishnah says, Arba Shebetoda. There were 40 lechamim that accompanied the korban toda for the 4 people that have to bring a korban toda, 4 categories of people have to thank Hashem. And each one of these 4 categories had 10 lechamim, all told 40 lechamim, and each one of these groups of 10 lechamim are absolutely essential to the korban. And the implication here is that if he brought a korban toda without the amount of lechamim that he needed, the korban is possible. The arbasha belulav, you need 4 species of the lulav, arbasha, mitzorah. Again, as we said before, with regard to the paraduma, the mitzorah also needs those 3 components. But then we add a 4th component, which is called shtei tziporim. There were 2 birds, and one was shechted, the other was sent out to the midbar, and these are all ma'akvim zeh. Now we go to the hazos. There were hazos for the paraduma, keneged the Pesach, and then there were hazos on Yom Kippurim for the Kohen Gadol. So first we have Shiva hazos shevipara ma'akvo zu et zu. Right, the Torah requires 7 sprinklings, which are called here hazos, and you have to have all 7. If you miss one of them, then I'm not sure exactly what happens if you miss one of them. Let's see if he adds anything here. It says Vehiza el nochach pnei ol mod midama sheva pa'amim. Okay, I'm not sure. Maybe we'll get to it in the sugya. I don't know. As to whether or not that it completely disqualifies the paraduma, I don't know. And then we have Sheva Hazoyos Shal Ben Abadim Shal Paroches V'Shal Mizbach Hazov Makvazuzu. Okay, so now, just one second, I'm sorry. I borrowed this Gemara, so, okay. So now we're talking about the special 2 korbanos that the Kohen Gadol brought on Yom Kippur, and the hazos. There were hazos, number 1, on the paroches. There were hazos bein abadim, and on the mizbeach hazov. So we now have the par and the soyer that's brought on Yom Kippurim, and we need what's called achas lamala, sheva lamata, and there were sprinklings on the bein abadim, means between the poles of the Aron Kodesh, of the Aron Abris, on the paroches. Paroches was the divider, the curtain that divided between the Kodesh Kadoshim and the Heichal. And once again, it's always going to be 1 up and 7 down. And then there were other korbanos that required hazos inside the Heichal itself. And those, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, are called the chatos hapnimius, where the dam is not applied as all other chatos to the mizbeach hanachoshes in the azor, but rather inside. For example, the korban chata shel Kohen Gadol, the par helim dovish shel tzibur, and also the soir of avodah zarah. These are chatos pnimios, and they too required a sprinkling of dam of sheva and sheva achas l'malat on the paroches. Just one second. What's the pasuk for this? It says v'hoisa zos lachem l'chukas olam, and the word chuka teaches me that it's li'ikuva. And then we have another pasuk that's Kodesh Yu Lashem La Kohen. Now there it says Yihu, which is called Havaya. Whenever it says the word Yihu, it means Likuva. And the Gemara therefore says, Shnei se'iri Yom Kippur ma'akvim zeh zeh chuka, Shnei kivsei atzeres ma'akvim zeh zeh havoya, Shtei chalos, this is the Shtei lechem of Yom HaShavuos. It says there havoya. Havoya always means likuva. Shnei starim, again with regard to lechem aponim, the 6 and the 6 is likuva, it says chuka. Shnei bazichin chuka. Hastarim v'abazikim chuka. Shnei minim shebenazir. It says Kain Yaseh, and whenever it says Kain Yaseh, it means it has to be done exactly this way. Shlosha Shebepara Chuka. Right, so we spoke about the Hazos for the Para Duma, and we spoke about the ingredients that have to be added to the Mechatos. There it also says Chuka. Arba Shebetoda. Right, we said that there are lachmei toda in 4 different categories, 4 different types, and that's going to be derived from a hekesh to nazir. It says by nazir. I'm sorry. First, we go through the pasuk by lachmei toda. It says by lachmei toda al zevach todas shlomov, and now the question is, what is the word shlomov adding here? Omar Mar, it's coming to teach me a hekesh to nazir. Shlama of the Rabbos, Shalmei Nazir. So the Torah is setting up a hekesh between Lachmei Toda and the El Shal Nazir. I'm sorry, the El Shlomim of a Nazir. Now, what is the Torah trying to teach us? Torah teaches us is that just like in the case of the Shalmei Nazir, there's a halacha of le'ikuva. I think we had that in the Mishnah. Do we mention Nazir? No, maybe we didn't mention Nazir. No. I don't know why it wasn't mentioned in the Mishnah here. Anyway, so the Torah compares and equates the carbon toda to the carbon of the Nazir. And in the case of the Nazir also has to accompany his karbanos with 4 categories of lechem, and each category is likuva, and therefore by virtue of the hekesh, we're going to derive the lachmei toda requires all 4 categories of the lechamim. Ve'arbosha b'mitzora, right? We had 4 things of mitzora. We added the state siparim at the end. Tichsiv zos tia. Again, the word tia means it has to be this way. Torah samitzora. Now again, Lekicha Tama means that he has to have all 4 species, but it doesn't mean you have to take them all at once. That's one sheet to that lulav tzarich agad. Omer Rav Chana bar Rav lo shanu ela she'ein lo. Right, so only if he leaves out one of the 4 species, if he didn't take them in one aguda achas, then, as we'll soon see, aguda is only a kiyum of zekin v'amveyu, but aguda to take them all together is not essential. Meisvei, we seem to have another shita based on the brisa that says harpa minim shebalulav shnayim mehen oseperos shnayim mehen ein oseperos. Right, so the esrog and the lulav both have peros. They grow on trees, and the fruits grow on trees. However, the hadassim and the aravas did not bear fruit, and the brisa claims that ha'osim peros use kukim l'sheinu osim v'l'sheinu osim use kukim l'sheinu osim ve'non v'yotzidei chavosim v'hen achiyu kula b'agudachas. So we see that there's a shita that both categories of the minim of a lulav are li'ikuva, and he has to take all 4, and they all have to be in one aguda. So there's one ma'isa l'kicha for all 4. Not the way we saw it until now. V'chein Yisrael ba'artza'ah. Achiyukula b'agudach. This is already an agadic statement that God will be appeased when all Klal Yisrael are together, like we read yesterday in the parsha of Vayachnu, Vayichan Sham Tachas Ahar. Shenemar habone b'shamayim al yosa v'agudaso al eretz yisada. And this is a pasuk in Amos, and the emphasis here is on the word agudoso. Agudoso means when there's a communal tainus. A tainus tzibur depends upon the participation of all factors in the community, both righteous and not so righteous. And it's connected the 13 components of the Ketores, one of which is called the Lavona. Tanoihi. So Gemara says whether or not you have to take the four minim in a single aguda is machlokas tanon desanya. And now we start with the sheet of the Tanakama. Lulav ben ogud ben sheino ogud kosher. Now, the fact that the Rabbanan say that it's kosher means that even the Rabbanan require lechatchila, the best ideal way to do it is to take the all four minim agudach. Rabbi Yehuda omer ogud kosher sheino ogud posel. So Gemara says, my time Rabbi Yehuda had it. Rabbi Yehuda derived the conclusion that you need aguda achas for the four minim. And the answer is we derive from a gzeres shava from agudas ezov in the Taras HaMetzora. Gomar kicha kicha agudas ezov. Just one second. So he says here that agudas ezov was at the time of Yetzias Mitzrayim. The Korban Pesach, right before the Yitzia Mitzrayim, they took a bundle of Azov and they dipped it into the blood offering and they put it on the doorposts. So there we know that it was all Baguda Achas, a bundle of Azov that was all bundled together. Is Malam Baguda Af Kan Ba'aguda. Rabban lo Gamri Kicha Kicha. Right, a Gzeir Shava, you have to have a Masorah. They didn't have the Masorah of the Gzeir Shava. But wait a second. Keman Asla Hadusanya Lulav Mitzvah Liogdo, Velo Ogdo Kosher. Hey, this makes no sense. According to Rabbi Yehuda, Aguda is Likuva. Keman, Ikra Rabbi Yehuda Ogdo Abai Kosher. Ikra Abana My Mitzvah. Why do you have to bother with bundling it all together at all? Yom Rabbana and Mishum Zekev Yaveyu. My mitzvah, there's a mitzvah of Hidur Mitzvah. Sheva Hazoyos Shebepar Makvos Zu Chuka. Sheva Hazos Shebeyal Ben Abanim Shal Mizbeachos Shal Mizparachos Makvos Zu. Now, how do we know? I mean, in the case of Sheva Hazos Shebepara, when we're not talking about Yom Kippurim, there it says Chuka. But the other series of Hazoyos on the in the Ben Abadim, or on the Parochas, or on the Mizbeach Hazov, there it doesn't say the word chuppah. So therefore, how do we know this? And the answer is because the Yom Kippurim ksiv chukah, that even with regard to the Hazoyos of Yom Kippurim, in the three different categories of Hazoyos, it says the word chukah. Now let me just read, if I have the pasuk here. It says in Vayikra Perek Tezayin, it says V'hoisa zos lachem l'chukas olam, and chukah, as we said, is always interpreted as being likuva. The parkoing mashuach. Now we're talking about the azos of the two. Of the kohen mashuach who gave a mistaken ruling and he violated a ruling sheish bokares, and he has to bring a par. And when he brings the par, he needs to do azoyos on the paroches. And we have another case of achatas pnimis of the par helam dovashal tzibur and seire avodas kochavim, when the entire community or rov of the tzibur violated a chi of kares based on a mistaken hora, or if they violated avodah zarah based on a mistaken hora, they have to bring achatas pnimis and all the hazos, all the yirisanya. So the Torah has a hekesh between the par of the Kohen Gadol, right? That's what he calls the par Kohen Gadol, Kol Mashuach. He calls the Kohen Gadol, and it also says that there's a par helim dovashal tzibur, and there's an equation between the two. And we have to do to this par the same way we did to the other par. Matam Lomer, what does this teach us? Lichbol ba'azoyos. That the same hazoyos that apply in one case of a par also apply to another case of the par.